So, Lori, I would love to invite you to the floor. He is a historian, an attorney, an HR consultant, and the author of Our Gay History in 50 States. He has a BA from Cal State Fullerton, a JD from the University of St. Thomas. He is the owner of Staff and Associates, a boutique employment law litigation practice. He's a public servant, has run for office, is a human rights commissioner, has won too many awards for me to count. So basically, all you need to know is this guy knows his stuff. So Zalori, take us away.
Perfect. Thank you for the invitation to be here today and to engage our amazing audience in regards to this important discussion in regards to the intersection really between the civil rights movement and the LGBT rights movement. It's important for us to know that that queer voices have always been there and have always been in positions of leadership and or the forefront. And so those are some of the stories that I'll be sharing with you today. You may know some of the individuals that I'll be highlighting later on in the presentation, and some of them may be a surprise to you. And so if you are, there's even folks within the Black community that are like, wait a minute, I didn't know. So if you need more details in regards to how it is that they are members of the LGBT community, you might just have to buy the book in order to be able to get that information and those details. So let's get started. Oh, we didn't want that music. All right. So normally folks are like, who is Zaylor and why is it important for me to hear what he has to say and what perspective does he have in regards to sharing on this important topic. This photo we all have our moms to thank for getting these important, momentous photos. So this is first day, first grade for me in Orange County in Anaheim, California, 1979. As you can see, there's a Tupperware lunch pail. So those individuals of a certain age will remember that was a staple in regards to folks kids going to school at the time. I lived about a mile away from Disneyland. So it's interesting is that it's a very diverse place, but then not as diverse of a place. So you will have folks there from all over the world. But there was not a critical mass of any other group besides white folks. And so, there was never and still isn't a critical mass of Black folks. So living and growing up in that community, I always knew that I was different than others because there weren't, I think there was about 3 Black kids in my elementary school and maybe 5 by the time I got to junior high school. And in high school, 5, 6, 7 max, and so that it was already part of a marginalized community from that perspective, being that there wasn't a critical mass of Black students. I have a disability. I was born with a disability to both my hands and my feet that impact the ability for me to be able to write and type. And, I joined band. I was a band geek. And so I did play the trombone and the baritone, but that, I couldn't necessarily play the clarinet or the saxophone or, the piano because you need dexterity with your fingers. And that was something that I lacked. And early on, I knew as well that I was a member of the LGBT community. My attraction was different than the standard attraction that you would have that was, socially acceptable even at the time. And so that provided, I think, a different perspective for me than maybe some other folks that were growing up in Orange County at the time. Fast forward to high school. I transferred from Orange County to Ventura, California. This is about, for those not familiar with Los Angeles, Ventura is about 2 hours north of downtown LA. It's a beach town and community, and at that location is where I first was confronted with racial issues. It was during the Rodney King time. It was during the Rodney King trials time. And so I ended up being a victim of a hate crime, actually, a skinhead at the end of school day with hundreds of students around, hopped out of a car. And this was a grown man. If my memory serves me correct, he was like 21, 22. Jumped out of the car, punched me in the face, called me a nigger, hopped back in the car and drove off. And so at the age of 17, I was thrust in the limelight in regards to speaking in front of school boards, meeting with leaders of the NAACP. There were gang members that approached me and was like, we know who he is. We can take him out if you want to. And, at 17, I'm in this leadership position and capacity to say, no, what we really need to have is, focusing on educating folks. Because if folks, had a better idea in regards to the significant contributions that the Black community has provided to this country, perhaps people will have a different perspective as it relates to things. And so that was the first riot that I got to live through, because the Rodney King riots happened after the trial. And then fast forward to Minnesota, where I live now, this would be the second race riot that I lived through after the murder of George Floyd. And so it's an interesting perspective. I don't know how many people can say that they've lived through, these two significant times of racial strife and tension in our country, and can attest to what is happening and has been happening on the ground, what built up to that, as well as, some insight in regards to what we can do to try to make it so that these types of situations don't happen.
So, was it triggering for you at all? I mean, did it feel like Groundhog's Day, like we're doing this all over again, 30 years later?
Yes, especially given the fact that, we knew that this was coming, right? Anybody that lived in these cities knew that it was coming. You lived in LA, you knew that it was coming. There were many, many situations with not only the interactions with the police, but also interactions, fatal interactions between the Black community and the Korean community in Los Angeles. Whereas here in Minnesota, there had been a litany of unarmed Black men being killed by the police. Then you had, a white woman that was killed by a police officer, and the police officer happened to be Black and was of African descent. And that ended up only being the only police officer that was actually held accountable and found guilty for his conduct in regards to that situation. And again, that's the kind of stuff that doesn't necessarily make national news, but we here in this community knew that it was only a matter of time that we got to this point.
So what is the story behind you writing Our Gay History in 50 States? Because I love this book, and I think it's such a clever idea, and I don't think I've seen anything like it.
Yeah, so to provide some quick background to folks, Our Gay History in 50 States is an LGBTQIA plus history book that highlights significant people, places, and queer facts on a state-by-state basis. So you can open up the book to any given state and get, your Reader's Digest version as it relates to the LGBT history for that given state. So the story behind the book, we got to go back to 2014. I was actually on a road trip cross country. So you think about America and Americana, you think about the open roads and road trips, and so that's what was happening for me. I normally had gone on road trips with my best friend, but this time he was unable to join me. So it was just me driving from California to Minneapolis. And I made that trip several times. And so during this time frame, the marriage equality debates were just really hitting a fever pitch. There was Proposition 8 that had been rolling in the courts in California. Proposition 8 was a proposition that was put on the ballot defining marriage between a man and a woman, and this was after Governor, not that time, it was Mayor Gavin Newsom had authorized for same-sex weddings to occur in San Francisco. The proposition passed, then it was in the courts and went up to the state Supreme Court. So there was all this struggle and strife as it relates to that at the time. Minnesota had become the first state to defeat a marriage amendment. And so there was some progress, because up to that point, every marriage amendment that was put up, ended up passing. Then we have, during this time, there was also the murder of unarmed Black men at the time. So we have Michael Brown, Eric Garner, as well as Tamir Rice, all killed by the police. And so, we have this juxtaposed positions and strife between two communities and two identities that I share. So each time I cross a different state line, I'm just thinking to myself, well, what relevance does this state have to any type of historical reference? And so I cross into Wyoming. Of course, I think about Matthew Shepard and how he was killed in a hate crime. Crossing over the line into Texas, I think of, James Byrd Jr., who was a victim of a racially motivated hate crime. And here's photos of these two gentlemen, if you hadn't seen them before, and they're the namesakes of the federal hate crime legislation that was later passed and signed, passed by the legislature and signed by President Obama. Here in this photo, on the left, we have Leuven Harris, and on the right we have Betty Byrd Boder. Both of them were sisters of James Byrd Jr. And in the middle we have Judy Shepard, the mother of Matthew Shepard. And so this is actually at the signing ceremony that happened in 2009. And so there's just all this grief and strife that's happening. Based on the Black community and the LGBT community here in this country. And I had the pleasure of finally meeting Judy Shepard, and this was in 2017 at the Quorum National Coming Out Day Luncheon. And that's when I discovered, hearing her speak, this was the 19th anniversary of Matthew passing. And National Coming Out Day happens to coincide with the passing of Matthew. And it was so hard, it was hard for Judy to make it through her comments. And it dawned on me that her and her husband, Dennis Shepard, were living through the worst day of their life every single day for 19 years for me and my community. And so I thought, if these are allies, I can do so much and give so much to my community, I need to do more. And so I thought back to the road trip that I had, and the idea that I was like, there should be a road trip guide where, LGBT folks should be able to go anywhere across this country. And so the idea of Our Gay History in 50 States was born. So within 2 weeks after speaking at the National Coming Out Day Luncheon, I was meeting with the publisher. 2 months later, I started writing the book. 2 years later, the book was out. And here we are. Our Gay History in 50 States is there. And, it's been approved as a textbook for the teaching of LGBT history in the state of Illinois. We're working on additional states so far. We have 6 states in the country that require the teaching of LGBT history. So I'm also involved in the advocacy to be able to get additional states to require a more diverse teaching of history, not just LGBT history, but Black history, women's history, Indigenous folks' history, disabled folks' history, just all of our collective histories.
It's so interesting that you mentioned that, because we're so far removed from being school children, obviously, and growing up in the South myself, I remember some things that we learned in history that seemed normal at the time, and in retrospect were very biased. And the War of Northern Aggression was a term that I learned at school, and so it's easy to forget how important that it really is. Kind of on that same vein as civil rights and the Civil War and intersectionality. Do you feel like there are parallels between LGBTQ plus civil rights movement and that of the Black civil rights movement? Because I feel like I always feel a little iffy whenever I try to compare different groups, because minority groups are all very different. Even within groups, they're so different. But could you kind of speak to that?
Absolutely. And I have to quote my really good friend, Rebecca Wagner, who's the executive director of Quorum, which is our LGBT Chamber of Commerce here in the Twin Cities. She always says, this isn't the oppression Olympics, right? It's not like who's the most oppressed, right? It's oppression is oppression is oppression. We'll get to some of this later on with some of the quotes that I'm going to provide to you. But there are definitely parallels. And one of the parallels thinking about the book and the importance of the book and the teaching of diverse histories is this, that, Black history isn't taught in schools, right? So, you hear what you learn about Black history is slavery. You hear a little bit about the civil rights movement. You hear about Martin Luther King, and that's about it. So being a Black person in America, I learned majority of Black history at home with my family, through my parents, uncles, aunts. But the difference between the Black community being able to learn history and the LGBT community is that, queer kids are rarely raised in queer homes. So where is it that they're going to learn their history? And so it's incumbent upon us, as members, as seniors, now I can say that, even though no, I'd say I'm not old, but I'm not a kid anymore. So, that it's up to us to be able to create opportunities and avenues for queer kids to be able to learn their history. So I just want to make sure that I threw that out, because there is a distinct difference between that and its important significance, especially when LGBT kids are growing up and they're always thinking that more often than not that they're alone and that they're, nobody else like them. And even with the internet, especially if they're in more conservative or rural states or counties in the country.
Well,
So
and
here's,
in
yeah, go
lieu
ahead.
of learning gay history, you kind of just learn gay stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And, everything that I knew about gay people until I was a teenager, every single thing was negative. And so I thought that was all that there was. Um, and so, yeah, I applaud you for, looking at it from a mentorship perspective, because it is so important.
And it's incumbent upon all of us to be able to do it, right? We're standing on the shoulders of those that fought before us, right? There's going to be a whole generation of kids that are growing up where being able to get married to their partner, whoever it is that they love, has always been something that's been available. Though when we were growing up, I mean, never would have expected that that's ever something that was going to be possible. It was just like, I'm never going to be able to get married, right? Um, but transitioning back to the parallels between the civil rights movement and the LGBT rights movement, African Americans have been fighting, especially during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, in regards to the promise of America, right? And these are promises that were provided in the founding documents that even the founding fathers didn't necessarily intend for it to be as encompassing and as sweeping as it is today. But the great amazing part about it is that it was drafted in such an aspirational way that we're able to work on ensuring that we have that more perfect union. So even anybody scrolling through and looking at old photos and images of the marches and the protests and the sit-ins of the civil rights movement, you'll see some of the same language that was used then in the 60s and 70s is being used now with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as individuals that are fighting for equality in the LGBT rights movement. So you have signs that are looking for equality, for human dignity, for fairness. Right here, you see signs where I am a man. Black men were seen to not be men, right, and as animals. And so just to be able to declare and proclaim your humanity was something that was significant and important. And some of the same dogmatic type of language and mindsets, even using religious texts to be able to justify discriminating against folks in all these different areas, is the same that's used against LGBT folks. And so again, it's just trying to be seen by society as either a man, as a person of value and worth, is critical and important. And so with the Black Lives Matter movement, you'll see some of the same language, right? We're looking for justice, we're looking for equality, we're looking for accountability. These are things that everybody should want. And more people are recognizing that. And as you can see here, there's a guy with a little pink triangle here. Queer folks are all in all of the movements. And so it's that we all should want that equality for everybody, especially since, more families now than were in the 60s are mixed race families, right? And you never know who's going to become, who in your family is going to end up being a member of the LGBT community as well. And so that's, demanding justice is really what it's all about. And just like Black folks don't choose to be Black, women don't choose to be women. The same thing as it relates to the LGBT folks, that you don't choose to be who you are. You are who you are from that perspective. And so again, more photos as it relates to the protests that happen. And then even here's again some of the protests and the signs from LGBT rights protests, just trying to demand the same equality that the Black community was fighting for. Now it's over, like 50 years ago now, 40, 50 years ago now. And one thing to make sure that I add is that, just like Black folks were discriminated against, in regards to redlining on housing and purchasing houses, in regards to the workplace, in regards to public accommodations, LGBT folks are fighting for the same thing, right? So as attorneys, many of us here, hopefully most of us, I think, you remember the cake and the case as it relates to the baker, and the gay weddings, right? It's the same thing, right? Whether you're putting a sign out saying no blacks allowed, you're putting a sign up saying no gays allowed. We're all fighting for equality from that perspective. And the one thing I want to make sure that I add for you, Nick, is that I think it's taken folks, some time to accept those parallels. I've had some very passionate and in-depth discussions with my stepfather, who's a historian. He's a big supporter of the LGBT movement and equality from that perspective. But there was a rub when I shared parallels with him as it relates to the civil rights movement. And at first, he was really against it. But then it was a year later, I hear him saying, bringing it up as if it was his idea, and I was like, wait a minute. I remember talking about this, but I was just happy that there was a progress as a evolution in regards to his mindset and his thought process as it relates to that. When I found this photo, I was like, I have to include this in all of my discussions on this issue. And it's like, one of these things never happened. So yes, there was not blatant, discrimination as it relates to drinking fountains and things of that nature. That is an important part of our country's history for us to be able to own and acknowledge. But the thing to recall and remember is that, LGBT folks just couldn't be out at the time at all. You hear about people remember the Red Scare with McCarthy, trying to root out all the communists in our communities and in the government. What people don't always necessarily know is that there was also a lavender scare that happened at the exact same time, and there were more folks purged from their jobs with the state or federal government through the lavender scare than folks that were purged for being alleged communists. And so it's, again, making sure that we're talking about and we're sharing details as it relates to those facts and those histories, so that we can see that the community, especially the LGBT community as well, since that's part of the focus of today's topic, is has been dogmatized and demonized as well. And so this is one that I ran across social media, and I was like, this is just on point statement. If you've never had the Supreme Court case decide if you have the same rights as others, you have privilege. And so, I know that we're going to get to talk about intersectionality in a bit, but there's certain areas of identities that I possess where I have privilege and others where I don't. And so it's understanding where those lie and using your position and you're using your privilege to be able to benefit those that aren't privileged in those given areas.
So important. And I dropped in the chat a link to the Lavender Scare documentary. It's super interesting and something that I did not know about until last year. And the whole rationale behind rooting out homosexuals in the government was that if a foreign power were to find out that they were living this deviant lifestyle, they would blackmail them and therefore, extract somehow national secrets, and that gays were a national security threat. And today, that logic just seems so extenuated that the only person blackmailing gays was the government, but neither here nor there. So intersectionality, talk to us about that. You've got a great wheel in this deck, and I think this is so... I'm a visual learner, and I think this takes a very complex topic and kind of boils it down a bit. So talk to us about this.
Absolutely. And for folks as well, we'll be providing the deck to folks after. So I'm sure that there's a way we can email that out to them, Nick, because I know folks always, and when we get to this part, they're like, I gotta have that. So the concept of intersectionality is the fact that, your whole self is right here in the middle. It's when you take into account any and all aspects of a person's upbringing, background, identities, and allowing individuals to fully actualize and realize and bring their full selves to work. So this center part composes of the 6 main areas as it relates to an individual's identity. So you have your physical ability, your age, your gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. However, there's all these additional areas, and I love that they have just a variety of different additional aspects of somebody's identity that significantly and still impacts in individuals, how society interacts with people. So let's say, for example, somebody that's native born versus foreign born. Huge difference as it relates to that, whether it be dealing with, birth certificates and who's able to run for president. Yeah, I had to throw that in there really quick. But, when we're talking about issues like, immigration and things of that nature, you have appearance and ideology, work background, education. And so I love this one because it gives, the basic, as well, I have to highlight geographic location, because we all have our biases as it relates to many of these different areas, especially as, when you hear somebody with a Southern drawl, there are assumptions that come along with that, unfortunately. And
They're dumb.
Right. And,
Yep. When I was
think of
growing
that.
up, I had a thick Southern accent, and I learned real quick that was not going to fly if I wanted to make any money at all.
And, PhDs and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it has no bearing in regards to it, but these are, again, the assumptions that come along with it. And so this is, the basic will that has all of these, but an additional slide that I love that I ended up coming across in cyberspace is this concept of the power and privilege wheel. And so this one really breaks down some of these areas into even more detail. So make sure you follow Sylvia Duckworth down here, who came up with this one. But the closer you are to the center, the more power and privilege that you have in regards to these areas. And the further you get out, the more marginalized you are. So, there's, education, there's, somebody that just has an elementary school education as opposed to somebody with post-secondary. You're going to be closer to the wheels of power as it relates to that, as opposed to, somebody that has an elementary school, or even folks that don't have an elementary school education. You have skin color here, whether you're white, you're olive skin as opposed to dark. And the important thing to know as it relates to concepts like skin color as well is that this isn't just something for, the white community, that some of these are interracial as well. So for folks that are Black, the fairer skin you are, you're going to have, just how society works, that you're going to be closer to the circles of power, as opposed to being on the darker skin side. And so same thing as it relates to, back. All right, gender and language and wealth and all these. So I definitely recommend taking a look at this one in more detail. I mean, there could be a whole discussion as it relates to the wheel separately after that.
And yeah, I love this wheel because it kind of just grazes the tip of the iceberg, because there are just so many different dimensions. And I think, I've spoken to colleagues and friends, who are white like myself, and they have a hard time getting past this idea that Black Lives Matter is saying that my life has been just, easy street because I'm white. Like, no one's ever said that white people have no struggles. And within, the white community, obviously someone who has a ton of cash probably has more influence and power than someone who is, poor or working class, like my family. So I love this chart, and just to reconfirm, we will be sending this out.
One thing I want to make sure I throw in too is even this one here, right? And this is an important one for our community, the LGBT community. Power as it relates to heterosexuality is closer to the wheels of power than gay men, and then everybody else, right? And so, I mean, these are things that we need to make sure that we recognize and try to combat. So wherever it is that you are on the wheel, and there may be areas where you're closer to the wheels of power, and other aspects where you're further out on the more marginalized side. Where you are closer to the wheels of power as it relates to that, that's an area where you want to make sure that you're ideally advocating for those that are more marginalized. And that's the focus and goal of this one.
Love it. So how does this look like in, I guess, real life? So taking it from a slide to life experience. Mm-hmm.
Well, racism is something that is and has always been present in our country's history, and this is, one of the main and important aspects that we're still wrestling with. I mean, it's been part of the amazing part about this new administration that's coming in is, I believe, the first time that we've had the president really, speaking truth to power as it relates to concepts of systemic racism in all its forms, whether it be in the government, whether it be in, policing or the like. And so it'll be interesting to see what transitions happen as it relates to that. But we don't have to look at that far out to see examples of this as it relates to George Floyd. And even I developed this deck a while back before the actions that happened at our nation's capital on January the 6th. But again, just showing the disparity in regards to police power that's exuded upon the population, and it's different as it relates to Black folks as opposed to those Black and brown folks as opposed to folks that are white. And so we're Minnesota, we're still not past this, because the trial is still coming up, and the Rodney King riots didn't happen until after the outcome of the trials. And so this is still going to be a focal point and a talking point as it relates to this issue nationally. And then you have, there's homophobia that seemed to have reared its head on a more public basis since the outgoing Trump administration as well. I believe GLAAD is the organization that has the running list of how many direct policy actions the administration had taken against the LGBT community, and I believe it was at least over 100 over the 4 years. And so it's just the ability for folks to be able to come out and be more forthright in regards to their hate towards any of these groups. But some folks love the numbers, so I have the numbers here for you as well. And this is from I believe it's the FBI as it relates to these figures. But on the right, you can see here race, ethnicity, and bias types of motivated categories of incidents of bias have amount to roughly 60%. LGBT 16%, religion is 18%. So, if you are, a Black or brown person that is Muslim and LGBT, I mean, look at the likelihood that you would be or could potentially be the victim of some type of bias type of crime. And so it's, the stats don't lie, and these stats, have not changed much, sadly, over the years, except for the fact that more folks are feel that they can live their lives out and openly, and so that's resulted in more crimes, I think, as it relates to the LGBT community, because people are coming out of the closet and living their lives out and open from that perspective.
I mean, it really does feel like layers. And if you look at, one of the community that, according to studies at least, is the most vulnerable to these sorts of hate crimes, it is Black trans women.
Yeah.
I think I saw a statistic that the average life expectancy it was like 34 years old or something insane like that. I'm
Yeah.
I know, but it still boggles my mind.
Well, two things I want to make sure that I add in as it relates to that. Number one, one of the more challenging times with me writing my book, got too far. Writing my book was having to read each and every one of the stories of a trans person of color, or mainly trans person of color that was killed in this country. And there was a time when I was writing the book, I just had to stop and take a 3-week break in regard to it, because it was just overwhelming in regards to reading each and every single one of these stories. I mean, there could be a whole separate book highlighting and uplifting the stories of these women that have been killed. It's just, I don't think people understand how overwhelming the numbers are. And so one thing that I found to be heartening from this new incoming administration is that that it's my understanding that there's going to be some type of task force that's going to be developed that's specifically going to be looking at this issue and trying to find ways to be able to combat this issue. And so again, it's, representation is important. Having diverse folks, in positions of power is important, because it determines what issues are looked into. And so those are two important factors I want to make sure I threw out there for you on this.
So important. Thank you so much. And since I saw a peek of your next slide, I have to know more about this person. So tell me about, the folks who, we have a lot, we have a lot to thank them for, but maybe they've, in history been overlooked or marginalized.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we have a litany of LGBT Black activist icons, from way back all the way up to present. And so I've identified some of them that are highlighted in the book, and I wanted to make sure depending on the time of the presentation, sometimes I'm able to provide clips of them actually, providing some of these quotes in their own words. I'm going to make sure that I read some of these for you. Angela Davis, iconic woman, known for her afro and being a member of the Black Panther Party, being one of the first and few women that was actually on the FBI's most wanted list. Civil rights leader back in the 60s and 70s, still active today, an educator and an academic, and still definitely involved in the process of, if my memory serves me correct, one of the co-founders of the women's march that happened after the election and inauguration of President Trump. So here's a quote that I have from Angela Davis that I found was, important and impactful, and it's interesting thinking about all this stuff in this time where we have an inauguration coming in and everything that's going on in regard to the outgoing administration at the time. I think the importance of doing activist work is precisely because it allows you to give back and to consider yourself not as a single individual who may have achieved whatever, but to be part of an ongoing historical movement. And Angela Davis has clearly been part of that ongoing historical movement. We have Bayard Rustin, who was Dr. Martin Luther King's right-hand man, was out and proud at the time, and it created some challenges within the civil rights movement, because there were people that said, you know what, Bayard can't, there were people that were pushing Dr. Martin Luther King to push Bayard Rustin to the side because he was an out Black man in the 60s and 70s, and they thought that would deter from the movement and what they were trying to accomplish in the civil rights movement. He is the architect of the March on Washington. That was him that made that happen. And so his quote is as follows: "If we desire a society of peace, then we cannot achieve such a society through violence. If we desire a society without discrimination, then we must not discriminate against anybody in the process of building this society. If we desire a society that is democratic, then democracy must become a means as well as an end." I mean, how poignant is that one today? And this is an old quote, right? An old quote. Malcolm X.
So one of the things about
Yes.
Bear that I really like is, number one, full disclosure, had no idea who this person was prior to last year and George Floyd. And he was so passionate about the movement, and he had, I guess, the perspective to realize that because of his intersectionality, that could be an issue. And so he largely stepped aside into the limelight because it was more important to him that the movement be taken seriously than personal accolades. And that type of leadership is something that I would love to have. And it's something that in modern times, I just haven't seen it. And it was just really inspirational for the folks that are joining. If you have, space on your book list, please read about this man. There are a few documentaries floating around, I believe. Very, very inspirational stuff.
And want to make sure that I add, Governor Newsom, I believe it was last year, ended up pardoning Bayard Rustin, who had a indecent conduct, a charge on his record from Pasadena, California, actually, where one of my law offices is, because based on the fact that gay men were targeted at the time in regards to just being gay men, and so he was arrested for engaging in allegedly lewd acts in public, and that was something that was removed from his record posthumously. So that was done by Governor Gavin Newsom, who is a significant and serious ally for our community and has been. All right, then we have Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X was, very famous for his bullet or the ballot speech. Former member of the Nation of Islam, was also assassinated. And so Malcolm X's quote, and what part that folks might not know is he was actually born in Nebraska, so Midwesterner. So the Malcolm X quote is, "You can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace until he has freedom." Always very succinct in regards to his words. We have Marsha P. Johnson. For folks that may not necessarily know who Marsha P. Johnson was, she identified many different ways. Sometimes she would identify as a drag queen. Sometimes she would identify as being transgender. And Marsha P. Johnson was there at the Stonewall riots and is tasked with being, one of the people that threw the first brick, which really sparked off the modern day LGBT rights movement. And sadly, many of our trans community members have been relegated to the side, and their stories have not been lifted up as being a significant part of our history. There's not only Marsha P. Johnson, but also Sylvia Rivera. I mean, those two are bosom buddies as it relates to the movement, and really spoke truth to power at the time, especially as it relates to the transphobia that was existent and is still existent within our own community. So the important message from Marsha is that, how can we as a community expect, the heterosexual community to fully accept us when we are unwilling to accept members of our own community? So Marsha's quote is as follows: I was no one, nobody from Nowheresville until I became a drag queen. That's what made me in New York. That's what made me in New Jersey. That's what made me in the world. And it wasn't really until Marsha's passing that her story was really uplifted. There's a great documentary about the death and life of Marsha P. Johnson. The community believes that she was murdered, and so again, the story of a trans woman, a Black trans woman that was killed, where we still don't know what happened. And so there's still folks working and fighting to try to bring justice to Marsha P. Johnson's death. We have two of the three founders of the Black Lives Matter identify themselves as queer Black women. So we have Patrisse Cullors on the left, and her quote is as follows: there's something, oh, do I have the, there it is, yeah. There's something radical and beautiful and deeply transformational in bearing witness to public accountability before a community gathered for the sake of wholeness. So accountability, whether it be for police violence, whether it be for systemic racism, it benefits all of us. It benefits all of us, and so that's a reoccurring message from the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we have Alicia Garza on the right, Alicia's makes the rounds on the news all the time. So she actually recently, I think Alicia had coined the insurgentists at the Capitol building as, quote, white ISIS, which has kind of gone viral a bit. So Alicia Garza's quote is as follows: I say this to people all the time. The reason we created Black Lives Matter in that way is because we wanted to build a sense of empowerment and self-determination. Early on in the development of Black Lives Matter, we set up some social media pages that we intended to offer information about anti-Black racism and state-sponsored violence, so people really understood what it looked like concretely in our present time. DeRay McKesson live streamed the protests that were going on in Ferguson. And so his quote is as follows. He has great books and stuff. He's always in his iconic Patagonia blue vest. And so his quote is as follows: checking the time, all right. So if your love for me requires that I hide part of who I am, then you don't love me. Love is never a request for silence. We have Andrea Jenkins, who is a trans woman. She's the vice president of the Minneapolis City Council, and her precinct is the precinct where George Floyd was murdered. Her quote is as follows: as an out African-American trans-identified woman, I know firsthand the feelings of being marginalized, left out, thrown under the bus. Those days are over. We don't just want a seat at the table, we want to set the table. And then finally, we have Philippe Cunningham, who is the first trans man to be elected to office in our country's history. Philippe is also, I live in Philippe's district. I was able to vote for him. And Philippe is also a member of the Minneapolis City Council, and his quote is as follows. And the reason, and a lot of the national discussion as it relates to, quote, defund the police or reimagine policing is coming from, these two members as well as others on the Minneapolis City Council. And his quote is as follows: "Not all marginalization is created equal. I think that it's necessary for folks to understand that if some of us are not safe, all of us are not safe. If some of us are experiencing injustice, all of us are experiencing injustice. Privilege creates blind spots."
I love that because, like, sometimes when you're in the heat of the moment, it's easy to forget that history is happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yep.
this is history. It's not, black and white pictures. It is, these, really young leaders who, at least I can say for myself, I mean, people who I did not know about a year ago. And it's been really inspirational to see their journey. Just a quick plug for the audience. Um, to input your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. Do you want to leave us with any parting thoughts, any parting wisdom?
Absolutely. I know folks may be familiar with the concept of being woke. Being woke has African American origins as it relates to a perceived awareness, as it relates to issues concerning social justice and racial justice. And I challenge folks in all my presentations to think about the concept of being woke in all the different areas as it relates to intersectionality. So one can be woke as it relates to racial justice, but they can be asleep as it relates to gender equality, right? And so I want to challenge folks to be more open-minded and more aware as it relates to the concept of being woke, and to try to find additional ways where you can open your mind and serve as an ally to others. Again, as it relates to histories, whether it be Black history or LGBT history, I think it's important not only for the communities to be able to learn their histories in schools, but it's good for everybody, because if everybody in our society knows that significant contributions have been made by men, by women, by folks from different religions and nationalities and genders and sexual orientations, there's going to be a less likelihood there will be discriminatory towards those individuals that are in their classroom, when they can see them in the textbooks and the significant contributions they've made towards our country. So, this is America right here. It's diverse. It's going to get more and more diverse. So we need to make sure that we uplift all the stories and tell an honest perception as it relates to history. So not erasing us and not erasing our history. And so with that, I think we're going to be opening it up to some questions, Nick.
Yeah. And so you might not know this, but one of my favorite pastimes is stalking your social media, because it is so active and, so educational and entertaining at the same time. And I was viewing, I think it may have been like a podcast or something like that, and you had brought up a quote from Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. And I don't remember the exact words, but the gist of it was her sending out a warning that, hey, we should be teaching civics in school. And I think that there was issues with school boards taking it out of the core curriculum. So interested in you expanding on that.
Yeah, I mean, Justice O'Connor gave us this warning when she retired, like, hey, civics, she saw that the biggest threat to us at our democracy was going to be the teaching of civics, and that the majority of school districts stopped teaching civics. And so if Americans didn't know how the government could work, they could be swayed in regards to, possibly, authoritarian type situations. And look at where we are today. I've spoken to many of the teachers that I know and educators, and as well as administrators, and they've said, one of the reasons and the drives for moving away from teaching civics is focusing on teaching the courses that students are tested on, right? And so, there's a balance as it relates to that. And so we need to value our democracy enough to be able to ensure that people understand how the democracy works, and to know that our president shouldn't treat the government like they're the CEO and be able to fire folks right and left and things of that nature. That there's a process, that there's a separation of powers, and the reason why that's something that's set up.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we may not have been tested on civics as children, but we're being tested now.
We are.
And I don't know how well we're doing, to be honest with you.
Well, Georgia, that's what I'll say.
Yeah.
But still, I mean, there's a dire need as it relates to this, and so hopefully there'll be some push to be able to, that'll be my push to the Biden administration, and whoever the incoming Secretary of Education is getting back to making sure that they learn civics. And it takes a generation, right, to get back to it. There's still going to be a huge chunk of our of our society and our community that didn't learn it. I know I did, and I loved it.
Yeah. So we had a question from the audience. I think you'll like this question. Where can I buy your book? So I put in the link to gay50states.com, hoping that's
Yes.
where you want people to go, because I've already let the horse out the stable.
No, that's great. And here's an interesting thing. And yes, I Amazon's great and amazing. The thing is with Amazon is that they take a huge premium out. And that's why you're able to get books the cheapest on Amazon. The benefit, and so what I recommend if you ever want to support authors, purchase the book where the authors recommend that you purchase the books. So for me, if you purchase the book directly through our website, gay50states.com, you get to decide that where the 10% of the book proceeds gets to get donated, and that's to an LGBT nonprofit. Through platforms like Amazon, you're not able to do these types of promotions where we're paying it forward. And so that's why I would encourage folks to be able to buy it directly through our website. And that's where you're able to get it signed as well. So,
I mean, I just learned something I did not know about the 10%. So I'm very glad I did not share the Amazon link.
thank you.
That's awesome. So I was, again, stalking you as I do, and I actually saw this article earlier this summer, and when I was getting some materials ready for today, I'd saved it on my computer, forgot I'd even saved it. And it was an op-ed that you had written 11 days after the killing of George Floyd. And there was a quotation in there that I thought was super powerful, because you shared some quotes from history. I will share a quote of current history because, that's what is happening here today. You wrote, "The Black community is tired. We are tired of being murdered. We are tired of being afraid when a police officer drives by and looks at us. We are tired of discrimination in the workplace, housing, and Linden. We are tired of explaining what white privilege is. We are tired of feeling the need to justify why our lives should matter to you." Super powerful quote. And, wondering 6 months later, do you feel any differently? Are those emotions just as strong as they were right after the killing?
Well, it's emotional hearing my words read back to me. But, the interesting thing, the thing that I would say, and I'm not sure, again, because I'm here in Minneapolis, the news that we get is our local news. So I know that not all of this is something that's reported nationally in the national news, but the whole community and the society came out in support of George Floyd in regards to holding the police accountable. So, I mean, the day after it happened, I went to the protest at the site. Everybody was social distanced. People were wearing masks and all that kind of stuff. But there were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people there. And the majority of the people there were not Black. They were white people. They were allies standing up and using their position of privilege to be able to say, this is wrong and this is enough and these people need to be held accountable. After the riots, Minneapolis came out with their brooms and their snow shovels and cleaned up the city. I'm not sure if that was something that was really shared on a national basis, but the sense of community that we had coming together, like we're going to get through this, and helping out this business owner that they may have never gone there before, people making concerted efforts in regards to supporting minority-owned businesses and developing task force in regard to things. It seems like there's been finally a breaking point of our society in regards to recognizing the importance of this. And so I am much more optimistic in regard to the fact that there is going to be a systemic change as it relates to these issues. I don't have all the answers. I think the fact that Kamala Harris is going to be the vice president, given the fact that she has experienced a life experience as being a Black woman and having Black family members that may have been on one side of this particular equation, and then being a prosecutor and the attorney general of a state, I can only hope that she will be able to bring that unique life position and perspective towards trying to find ways to be able to address this issue.
Amen to that. So our last question before I will break. This is a great question. Would you be open to your book being made into a documentary? And I will add upon that question, would you be open into your life being made into a documentary?
Oh, well, my life, that would be crazy. Yes, the answer is yes on all fronts from that perspective. Yeah, it's interesting how this book has taken off and has been so well received across the country. As you said, receiving awards. A lot of the big awards are coming up in the spring this year, so I have my fingers crossed as it relates to that. But one of the important things for me was I was, as I was driving across country, I was thinking about while driving through red states and conservative states and counties, why do they hate us so much? And it's a lot of times because people that are LGBT that live there leave because they don't feel the sense of community, that there's a sense of belonging or that they can live and thrive there. So they leave and go to a San Francisco, a New York, a Florida, or Chicago. I want kids from those areas to be able to stay there. I want them to be able to know that in Idaho, that in North and South Dakota, that in Alabama, that there have been LGBT folks that were born and raised there that have made significant contributions and people know their names and things of that nature. And they should be able to stay there and thrive in their communities. And I look forward to a day when that's going to be something that can happen. And so I wrote, part of the reason why I wrote the book was thinking about those queer kids, right? And the ability to provide some inspiration for them to be able to stay where they are and not feel like they have to flee their homes and their community.
That is such wisdom, and I'm not going to try to top that. I'm just going to close with those really impactful words. Mr. Stout, thank you so much for stopping by. And again, Our Gay History in 50 States. Order it, and not on Amazon.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me. I always love, our connections and the LGBT Bar Association. I mean, awesome, amazing, and great in regards to everything that they do.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot.